Thank you, Madam President. I'll only speak once on this, but it might be a little bit longer than some of my colleagues. I see that we're continuing to make improvements to the comprehensive plan, even here at the 11th hour, and that's good. I'm supportive of those. The 14 goals of this 2040 comp plan were good. We have the right goals. This is a huge body of work. It was mentioned, it's actually almost as big as the budget book I compared. This plan speaks to so many things, and we haven't talked about a lot of these things, a lot of other parts of this plan, and there's some good stuff there, because to me, the public conversation has been intensely focused on land use and built form mostly, because that's where we see the biggest changes taking place. Yet these goals, including eliminated disparities, equitable civic participation, proactive, accessible, and sustainable government, now we work on those goals a lot. We work on them every day at City Hall together. But I wonder, can you say this comp plan is a model of that? Really? Unfortunately, I feel the 2040 plan is aspirational in important ways, and it also falls short. It does very little to create opportunities through some of these maps that might actually help achieve these goals in parts of our city like mine. The places furthest away from the downtown core makes affordable housing we have harder to keep. That's been my understanding throughout this process. That's not achieving our goals. That's not accessible, affordable housing. I'm all for a charge to be bold when that's warranted. I'm all for innovating and making important changes to make climate change. But this is untested, and the risk we're taking is something that we can't walk back. And I wish we'd have settled on something more incremental. When I first met with Long Range Planning regarding their first draft of this plan, I was really skeptical, but challenged myself to stay open-minded. I was assured that this is a really rough draft, lacking specificity, a launch pad, they said, to welcome new ideas and feedback and ideas from the community. Immediately, I knew that what I would call the striped zoning of corridors and the significant increase to fourplexes was going to be controversial. This was a big departure from keeping development compact at neighborhood nodes. At this point, though, no one would have ever heard about this plan. One of my core values as a policymaker here is transparency, and that's why I asked colleagues on the steering committee to support sending a letter to residents to simply inform them that a public input period was taking place here. This is a dramatic change, I said. I was, and I am still frustrated that the engagement around the first draft didn't involve any physical mail. Colleagues felt that wasn't needed, yet we send it for things like shoveling our sidewalks, we send it for elections, so why would we not make that part of this communication strategy? Without agreement for citywide mail, I sent my own, using my own board office budget because I felt engagement was lacking. And that one letter led to hundreds and hundreds of responses, the vast majority of which expressed some level of concern, and oftentimes a lot of input for changing draft 2, just like I'd asked them to provide. While many were quite demanding, we stuck up for the process long-range planning laid out, encouraging folks to submit their comments and be patient to see them considered in the second draft of this plan. Boy, were we duped. I was assured that council offices would play a role in shaping draft 2. That makes sense, right? That prior to this release, I, an elected council member tasked to make policies on behalf of the city of Minneapolis, would actually get to weigh in on this plan. Frankly, that singular one-hour meeting was insulting and a blatant disregard for this process. And I believe you know that. I believe long-range planning knows that. How is that a transparent process? This feedback wasn't taken seriously. I wasn't consulted in any way that could meaningfully shape this plan between versions 1 and version 2. This department had embargoed conversations with media outlets prior to meeting with council members, and finding that out, I fully understood this was not a document inviting any of the considerations I'd been collecting all summer long. But enough about broken promises and broken processes for a minute. I take great umbrage with the output of where we got in the second draft. The second draft was all too similar to me to the first. It turns out the intent was to reframe the narrative instead of acknowledging Maybe feedback suggests we've gone a bit too far. I've never heard from so many constituents regarding one singular issue. The vast majority of those messages came with recommendations for improvement. Whether it be upzoning corridor nodes, and yes, that's real, that's feedback I got, keeping the density in between lower for clustered development, environmental improvements, speculatory builder concerns targeting the more affordable homes in our city, there were a lot of concerns and input. None of that made it into the second draft. The first draft, it feels, wasn't a draft. It was an agenda that a city department was trying to push. So when version 2 snuck out the door before my promised follow-up meetings with long-range planning, promised to me by this department's leadership, it didn't reflect the feedback we'd received. It didn't reflect requests to address things like absentee landlords, to lift up affordable homeownership and local wealth building, to concentrate density in areas that make sense instead of haphazardly leaving it up to developers, to truly address the affordable housing crisis and to show with some or any kind of data that this plan would lead to affordability. Those issues were left unincorporated. So upon asking, when do I now get to forward input, I was told during markup, yet another broken part of this process. Council members like me were chastised for bringing forward several amendments, and staff decided to quit helping our offices write them up. If staff didn't have the capacity to aid council offices, then it should have been made clear earlier they should have dedicated more time before adoption. And if any of my colleagues are frustrated that some of us came with more than a handful of amendments to discuss, it's because this is when we were told to do so. These little things we were able to do at the end, I appreciate my colleagues for considering them. I do think many of these last amendments made the plan better. And since there's no support for turning back, I hope you've seen me work with you here at the end to improve this document. And given where the public discourse has gone on this, so many changes had to come in one big assembled map packet led by President Bender. And I really value her getting that together, because otherwise I don't think we'd have gotten this done. Thank you. This process has lacked transparency and accountability from the beginning. Hiring a public relations firm to sell a narrative to the public instead of spending money on actual engagement, not having a rigorous work plan or work product for how comments were analyzed, not being prepared enough to have a communication strategy, one that we could follow through on for this plan, misleading council members like myself on how and when their input, and thus the input of their residents, would be incorporated. Creating a false narrative that this plan inherently guarantees affordability, which it does not. Simply building more does not lead to affordability, and saying that by pairing it to an inclusionary zoning ordinance that hadn't come through at the time and at this point today is going to be a temporary measure, I feel is irresponsible. But that's not all. I'm appalled and I'm saddened that the narrative of this plan took on a really negative discourse. These goals are correct. We all agreed on that. And most of the feedback, I'd say, strongly agrees with these 14 goals. But through this past year of comp plan development, constantly putting people down because we disagree on the avenues to take in order to achieve these goals is wrong. And when we do it as council members, when we turn to things like social media and send these insults, that's an abuse of this office. Reverting to divisive rhetoric is getting us nowhere, you see. People in our city have expressed a genuine concern for our entire city about the effects of these proposed changes. Neighborhoods should not be turned into commodities for temporary exploitation, no matter where you live. After all this, how can we look residents in the face and ask for their feedback on anything after this? I think we've done them all a disservice. So yeah, we had the right goals, but we have the wrong comp plan.
Okay. Councilmember Ellison is next in queue to speak.